For 4 decades, if you caught a glimpse of something streaking across the Nevada sky, something that moved too fast to be real, too high to be human, you didn't witness visitors from another world. You witnessed the fingerprints of one man, Kelly Johnson. He engineered machines that kissed the edge of space and outran bullets fired from a rifle barrel. He created phantoms that defied physics. He remains the most guarded, most secretive engineer America has ever known. And his empire, his revolution, it all began inside a reeking circus tent, wedged right next to a plastics factory where the air burned your lungs. Clarence Kelly Johnson didn't arrive in this world wrapped in privilege or comfort. He was born to Swedish immigrants in a forgotten mining town buried deep in Michigan's frozen north. His family had nothing. He grew up hard, grew up hungry, and grew up with a mind so sharp, so relentlessly brilliant, it bordered on dangerous arrogance. At school, the other kids tormented him because of his name, because he was different. So he hit back. He didn't just defend himself. He fought with a fury that earned him respect and a new name, Kelly, that fire, that refusal to back down. He carried it straight into the refined, gentlemanly halls of aviation engineering, and he tore that world apart with his bare hands. 1933. Johnson walks through the doors of Lockheed Corporation. He's 23 years old, green as grass, sharp as a blade. Most rookies in his position keep their heads down, bring the coffee, say yes sir, no sir, and learn by watching. Not Kelly. His very first assignment, he takes one look at the senior designer's prized model for the new Electra airliner, and he tells the man to his face, "This design is unstable. It's garbage." You can imagine the room. The senior engineers, jaws on the floor, faces red with shock. Who does this kid think he is? But here's the thing. He wasn't wrong. He was dead right. Johnson tore apart the design and rebuilt it from scratch. The Electra became one of the most successful airliners in aviation history. Lockheed realized in that moment they hadn't just hired an engineer, they'd unleashed something wild. By 1937, storm clouds were gathering over Europe and Asia. The United States Army needed a fighter plane, but not just any fighter. They wanted a high-altitude interceptor, something that could climb into the thin air where bombers hid and rip them out of the sky. The specifications they handed out were borderline absurd. They wanted a plane that could hit 360 miles per hour and climb like it was being pulled by a rope. Every other company looked at the requirements and said the same thing. Can't be done with a single engine. So Kelly looked them in the eye and said, "Fine, I'll use 2. He designed the P-38 Lightning. It was a beast unlike anything the world had ever seen. Instead of a traditional fuselage, it had a central pod housing the pilot and the guns, with 2 massive booms stretching out on either side to hold the engines and turbosuperchargers. It looked like someone had taken 2 planes and welded them together in a fever dream. Critics sneered. They called it ugly, a mechanical monstrosity, a freak. But when that machine roared down the runway and lifted into the sky, it didn't just fly. It screamed. It became the first American fighter to crack 400 miles per hour. It was so blindingly fast that pilots began encountering something terrifying, something nobody had ever faced before: compressibility, as the plane hurtled toward the speed of sound. The air ahead couldn't get out of the way fast enough. It bunched up, formed a shock wave. The controls would lock, the stick would freeze in the pilot's hand, and the plane would tip forward into a screaming, uncontrollable dive straight into the earth, killing the man strapped inside. It wasn't just a technical problem. It was a death sentence wrapped in mystery. The sound barrier wasn't a wall you could see. It was a graveyard waiting in the clouds. Kelly Johnson didn't sleep through those nights. He lived in the numbers, drowning in calculations, testing, recalculating. While other engineers threw their hands up and guessed, Johnson solved it. He designed dive flaps, elegantly simple metal strips that disrupted the shock wave just enough to give the pilot back control. He didn't just save the plane, he saved hundreds of lives. And that plane, the P-38, it went on to change the war. It was a lightning that hunted down and shot Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto out of the sky over the Pacific. The mastermind behind Pearl Harbor killed in his own airspace. The mission was flown in complete radio silence, every second choreographed, every mile calculated. 1943. The P-38 is tearing through the Pacific theater, dominating the skies, feared by every Japanese pilot who sees its twin-boom silhouette. But across the ocean in Europe, intelligence officers are receiving reports that make their blood run cold. The Germans have built something new, something without propellers. The Messerschmitt 262, a jet. The United States Army Air Forces went into full panic mode. They were fighting a jet war with piston engines, bringing fists to a shootout. The technological gap was horrifying. So the Air Force made a desperate call to Lockheed. They needed a jet fighter, and they needed it now. Not next year, not in 2 years, now. They schedule a meeting. They sit down with Kelly Johnson, lay out the problem, and ask the question everyone's been dreading. How long will it take to build a prototype? 2 years? 3? Kelly looks at them across the table. He doesn't hesitate. He doesn't flinch. I'll give you a flyable jet in 180 days. The room falls into stunned silence. 180 days is impossible. It takes half that time just to design the landing gear alone, let alone build an entire aircraft from nothing. But Johnson isn't finished. He leans forward. I can do it, but you need to stay out of my way. No bureaucracy. No inspections. No interference. I pick my team. I pick the hours. And nobody, and I mean nobody, tells me how to run my operation. The general, desperate, with no other options, agrees. But there's a problem. Lockheed's main factory is running at full capacity, churning out bombers for the war effort. There's no room for Kelly's secret side project, so they get creative. Kelly rents a circus tent, yellowed and sagging. He finds an old machine shop tucked right next to a plastics factory. The smell is unbearable, a toxic cocktail of burning plastic and chemical rot that clings to your clothes, burns your throat. One of the engineers, choking on the fumes, answers the phone one day wearing a gas mask and jokes, Skunk Works, a reference to a moonshine distillery from a comic strip everyone was reading. The name sticks. The Skunk Works is born. Johnson handpicks 23 engineers, the sharpest minds he can find, the best of the best. He lays down the law. He writes what will become legendary, the 14 Rules of Skunk Works Management. Rule 12, mutual trust between the military and the contractor, no exceptions. Rule 13, access by outsiders is strictly, ruthlessly restricted. He creates a culture built on speed, silence, and precision. Be quick, be quiet. Be on time, the clock starts ticking. They have no computers, no digital calculators, just slide rules, raw intuition, and grit. They work 10-hour days, 6 days a week, sometimes more. Kelly Johnson is everywhere at once. He's inspecting rivets with a magnifying glass. He's screaming at suppliers over the phone. He's sweeping metal shavings off the floor at midnight. Day 130. The engine finally arrives, shipped from England. It's a British Goblin engine, designed by the legendary Frank Whittle's company. History, once again, winding itself into a knot. Day 143. 37 days ahead of schedule, ahead of the impossible. The XP-80 Shooting Star sits completed on the workshop floor. They tow it out to a dry lake bed under the brutal Nevada sun. The desert heat shimmers off the fuselage. The test pilot climbs into the cockpit. The British engine spools up with a rising whine that cuts through the silence. Kelly Johnson stands on the edge of the runway, a cigar clenched between his teeth, his entire reputation, his career, his life's work riding on this single moment. The plane rolls. It lifts, it flies. The first operational American jet fighter, sleek and fast, built in a stinking tent by a gang of rebels who ignored every rule ever written. The Army is ecstatic. They order mass production immediately. But for Kelly Johnson, the P-80 was just the beginning, just the warm-up act. The war ends before the jets see real combat. The Nazis fall. But a new enemy rises in the east, cold and silent, the Soviet Union. And this new war, this Cold War, won't be fought with dogfights and bombs. It'll be fought with secrets, with shadows, with information. The government needs eyes in the sky. They need a plane that can fly so high that Soviet radar can't even see it, let alone touch it. Kelly Johnson is about to get the phone call that will rewrite aviation history forever. He's going to build the U-2. But this time, the challenge isn't speed, it's altitude. And the men flying it won't be soldiers. They'll be spies. Kelly Johnson had already proven he could build a jet faster than anyone on Earth. But the world kept shifting beneath his feet. The Nazis were gone, replaced by a silent, calculating adversary, the Soviet Union. America was flying blind. The Soviets detonated their first atomic bomb in 1949, shattering the nuclear monopoly. Stalin was building missiles, factories, armies, but nobody knew where, and nobody knew how many. President Eisenhower needed to see inside Russia, needed intelligence, needed proof. But sending a plane over Soviet airspace was an overt act of war, unless that plane flew so high they couldn't touch it, couldn't reach it, couldn't do a damn thing about it. Enter the CIA. They didn't want a fighter. They wanted a ghost. They approached the Air Force with a radical, borderline insane proposal, a plane that could fly at 70,000 feet. To put that in perspective, commercial airliners today cruise at 35,000 feet. 70,000 feet is the edge of space. The sky turns black. You can see the curve of the Earth bending away beneath you. At that altitude, Soviet radar would struggle to even track the plane, and their missiles would burn out trying to climb high enough. The Air Force said it was physically impossible. The air up there is too thin to support wings. So the CIA called Kelly Johnson. Kelly didn't argue. He didn't debate. He just started drawing. He took the narrow fuselage of a fighter jet and bolted on massive glider-like wings that stretched out like a bird of prey. He called it the CL-282. The CIA called it the U-2. But there was a brutal problem. To reach that altitude, the plane had to be impossibly light. Every ounce mattered. Johnson became obsessed. He stripped out the armor. He ripped out the ejection seat system. He even removed the conventional landing gear. Instead, he designed pogo wheels, little stabilizers that dropped off the wings the moment the plane left the ground. To land, the pilot had to balance the entire aircraft on a single central bicycle wheel, like performing a tightrope act at 70,000 feet. It was dangerous. It was fragile. It was essentially a flying camera wrapped in tinfoil and hope. But where do you test a plane that doesn't officially exist? You can't roll it out at a public airfield. Kelly pulls out a map of the Nevada nuclear test range. He finds a dried-up salt flat in the middle of nowhere called Groom Lake. Remote, hostile, perfect. He calls it Paradise Ranch to trick workers into volunteering for the assignment. Today, we know it by a different name, Area 51. Kelly Johnson didn't just design the plane. He built the entire base from scratch. Area 51 is now the most infamous secret facility on the planet. August 1955, the U-2 takes flight. It climbs and climbs and climbs until it reaches 70,000 feet. The pilots, sealed inside partial pressure suits because their blood would literally boil if the cabin lost pressure, look down on the world like God's surveying creation. For 4 years, the U-2 is untouchable. It flies over the Soviet Union with absolute impunity, photographing bomber bases, missile silos, submarine pens, everything. The Russians can see it on their radar screens, a faint blip moving across their homeland, but they can do nothing. Their MiG fighters stall out, trying to reach it. Their missiles explode miles below, harmless fireworks. Kelly Johnson had built a ghost that floated above the world, but technology never stops moving. May 1st, 1960. Pilot Francis Gary Powers is flying deep inside Soviet airspace over Sverdlovsk. He feels safe. He is untouchable, 70,000 feet up, invisible, invincible. But the Russians had been working. They'd developed a new surface-to-air missile, the SA-2 guideline. And they didn't just fire one, they fired a barrage, a wall of explosives. A shockwave from a nearby detonation snapped the U-2's fragile wings like matchsticks. The plane disintegrated in mid-air. Powers didn't die. He ejected, parachuted down, and was captured alive. It was a geopolitical catastrophe. The United States caught red-handed, exposed, humiliated. The invincible spy plane displayed in pieces in Gorky Park for the world to see. Kelly Johnson watched the news reports in horror. His creation hadn't failed. Physics had just caught up. He realized in that moment that altitude was no longer protection. If you can't hide up high, there's only one other option. You have to outrun the bullet. The CIA comes back to the Skunk Works, terrified, desperate. They can hit us at 70,000 feet, they say. What do we do now? Kelly Johnson leans back in his chair. He's already been thinking about this, working the problem in his head for months. We stop floating, he says, and we start sprinting. He proposes a plane that will fly at Mach 3, 3 times the speed of sound, faster than a bullet fired from a rifle. A plane so fast that by the time enemy radar picks it up, it's already gone, already across the border, already home. But at Mach 3, the friction from the air is so intense that aluminum, the metal every airplane in the world is made from, would melt like butter under a blowtorch. This plane would have to be built from something else, something rare, something incredibly difficult to work with, something insanely expensive. Titanium. There's just one problem. The United States doesn't have enough titanium. You know who does? The Soviet Union. In one of the greatest ironies in Cold War history, the CIA sets up a network of fake shell companies to secretly purchase Soviet titanium on the global market. The Russians are literally selling the raw material that Kelly Johnson will use to build the spy plane, designed to fly over their cities and photograph their secrets. Project Oxcart begins. The plane looks like a black dagger forged in hell. It leaks fuel on the runway because the metal panels are designed loose, engineered to expand and seal only when the friction heat makes them glow. It is the most difficult engineering challenge in human history. They have to invent new tools just to cut the titanium. They have to invent new fuel that won't explode at 400 degrees. Kelly Johnson is pushing his team past the breaking point, past exhaustion, past sanity. But he isn't just building a plane, he's building immortality. 1964. The Skunk Works has completed the successor to the U-2. It sits on the tarmac at Area 51 under the desert sun. It looks like a spaceship pulled from science fiction. But there's a problem. It's leaking fuel, dripping onto the concrete, pooling beneath the wings. To an outsider, it looks broken, a disaster, a failed experiment. But to Kelly Johnson, it is absolutely perfect. You see, this plane is designed to fly at over 2,000 miles per hour. The friction from the air will heat the titanium skin to 500 degrees Celsius. The metal will expand, the panels will stretch and grow. If he built it tight and sealed on the ground, it would rip itself apart once it hit speed. So he built it loose. It only seals when it screams. The SR-71 Blackbird. The pilots who flew it didn't wear leather flight jackets. They wore full pressure suits, astronaut gear. They were flying at the edge of space 3 times the speed of sound, faster than the Earth's rotation. At that speed, at that altitude, you could watch the sun set in the west, flip the plane around, and watch it rise again from the wrong direction. It was the ultimate paradox in engineering. A plane fragile and broken on the ground, but utterly invincible once it took to the sky. Kelly Johnson had solved the missile problem with raw, brutal physics. The standard operating procedure for an SR-71 pilot when Soviet radar detected a surface-to-air missile launch was elegantly simple. No fancy evasive maneuvers. No hard banking, no diving. The pilot simply pushed the throttle all the way forward. The Blackbird would accelerate. The missile, already flying at its maximum velocity, would try to catch up, try to intercept. But the plane was moving so fast, pulling away so quickly, that the missile would simply burn through its fuel and fall back to Earth, defeated, helpless. It remains the only aircraft in history that could outrun a bullet. But building the ultimate machine exacted a price. Kelly Johnson ran the Skunk Works like a dictator, ruthless and uncompromising. He was famous for what became known as the nickel tour. If an engineer screwed up, made a critical mistake, Kelly would walk up to his desk, flip a nickel onto the surface, and say coldly, "Call your wife. Tell her you're fired." He was brutal, demanding, terrifying. But his team loved him, worshipped him, because he protected them like a lion protecting its pride. When Air Force generals tried to interfere with the design process, Kelly threw them out of the building. When bureaucrats tried to slash the budget, Kelly threatened to quit on the spot. He built a fortress around his engineers so they could do the impossible without interference. As the 1970s arrived, the world shifted again. Radar technology was advancing rapidly. Speed alone was no longer enough. The Soviets were building faster missiles, smarter tracking systems. Kelly knew in his gut that the era of faster and higher was ending. The next revolution would be invisibility. Before he retired, he laid the foundation for the next breakthrough. Stealth, he passed the torch to his protege, Ben Rich, but the DNA of the Skunk Works, the obsessive secrecy, the breakneck speed, the relentless can-do mentality. That was all Kelly carved into the walls, embedded in the culture forever. Kelly Johnson retired in 1975 after designing over 40 aircraft. He had won every major aviation award in existence. He had advised presidents and generals. But without the pressure, without the impossible deadlines, without the smell of jet fuel and titanium shavings filling his lungs, he began to fade. He once said, "I'll design you any airplane you want, but I will not suffer fools." In retirement, he watched helplessly as the aviation industry became bloated, slow, strangled by bureaucracy and red tape. Everything he despised, everything he had fought against his entire life. The man who built a jet fighter in 143 days watched as new aircraft programs dragged on for 20 years without producing a single flyable prototype. In 1990, the SR-71 Blackbird was officially retired from service. On its final flight, it shattered one last record. It flew from Los Angeles to Washington, D.C. in 64 minutes. The pilots climbed out of the cockpit and handed the flight log to the Smithsonian Museum. The ink was still wet on the pages. Kelly Johnson died that same year, as if he and his greatest creation were bound together by an invisible thread. When the bird stopped flying, the master stopped breathing. Today, if you visit the Smithsonian Air and Space Museum, you can stand beneath the Blackbird's shadow. You can see the titanium skin that rippled and glowed at Mach 3. You can see the seams that leaked fuel on the ground. It looks like something from another world, something impossible. But it wasn't built by aliens or secret conspiracies. It was built by a poor kid from a frozen mining town in Michigan who refused to accept the word impossible, who refused to bow, who refused to quit. Kelly Johnson didn't just build airplanes. He built the future, piece by piece, rivet by rivet. And he did it in a circus tent with a slide rule, a cigar, and an iron promise. Be quick, be quiet, and always, always be on time.